So my name is Joe Henderson, and I'll introduce myself in a little bit, and we'll get going. I'm going to speak for about 40 minutes or so, 45 minutes or so, to have about 10 or 15 minutes at the end. And I'm just heartened, I guess, that everybody is here. I think this is a difficult topic and some hard topics to talk about. And there's, 100+ people on this, which clearly shows me that people care about this, and that's heartening. So thank you all for being here. Thank you to the hosts. Northern New York Libraries, and especially to my friend Chessie, who kind of helped set some of this up, and to Christy for all of her work on this. So who am I? I'm a faculty member at Paul Smith College. I'm in the Environment and Society Department. I identify as an environmental social scientist, and particularly an anthropologist of environmental education. So I'll talk a little bit about how this informs this work. But I did my undergrad at Colgate University. I know there's a couple of people here from Colgate. So I was one of the few working class kids at Colgate, which was an interesting experience. Did my PhD at the University of Rochester, where I studied the sustainability movement as a kind of upper class phenomenon, and then did a bunch of postdoc work after that prior to coming to Paul Smith's. But most of this was at the University of Delaware, where I was studying climate change education, and I'll actually make some connections there as well because it's related. So this is what I study. I'm interdisciplinary in my orientation. I'm trained in anthropology, education, environmental studies with a little bit of human geography. And I look at basically how culture and politics shape how humans relate to nature and kind of vice versa. So I think about how humans think about nature, how that becomes institutionalized, why science becomes enrolled in political struggle. You can see some of the classes I teach there. Interestingly, lately, I've taught a class on video game culture, which, if you know anything about Gamergate, is super interesting to think through in the context of what we're going to talk about today. I also have the privilege of taking Paul Smith students abroad, and right before everything locked down, I got back from South Africa with a bunch of students, which is by some measures the most racially and economically segregated country in the world. And then hopefully we will be going to Denmark. My Denmark trip got canceled because of COVID, and hopefully we'll be rescheduling that. Denmark, by some measures, is the most equitable country in the world, although still quite racist in many interesting ways. So that's kind of who I am and what I teach. Here's a couple of kind of recent-ish publications. Most of my scholarship in grad school was around something called neoliberalism, which is not a political ideology that is talked about very much explicitly in the United States, although it is kind of one of the dominant shaping ideologies in the country. And I can say way more about that in the Q&A if people are interested in that. But I'm basically interested in politics and science and environmental issues. And so if you want to contact me, I can send you any of these if you're interested. So let's talk about anthropology for a little bit. So without getting too far into my kind of cultural anthropology class, it's important for the purposes of this talk to just note that human beings construct and inherit webs of significance, and I'm using kind of Clifford Geertz's term there, systems of meaning that shape how we perceive the world and how we enact the world, right? Worldviews, behaviors, this stuff is perceived as normal or natural or kind of common sense. That's what we call culture. Culture is a notoriously slippery term to define, and so take the whole cultural anthropology class that I teach is on this. We're going to spend a lot of time today talking about symbols and artifacts, and I want to just talk about kind of what's called semiotic anthropology, so the study of symbols, the study of signs, the study of flags, quite a bit of flags today. These are marks or objects that are vested with meanings, but social meaning and personal meaning. And so ways that people identify themselves as members of groups and things that are vested with significance. So some examples. And I should say, actually, while you stare at this picture of Confederate flag truck nuts, because this is a kind of educator and library audience, you're going to see a ton of book references throughout the course of this. And I wanted to just there's a lot of people who know a lot more about this than I do, and I wanted to kind of highlight that for everybody. So, the kind of first one I'm going to mention here, Liliana Mason, political scientist, talks about how um, political identity in the United States has become a kind of major source of identity, and we have a kind of very politically polarized population in this country, and increasingly there's something called negative polarization. So not only do we disagree with people, but we objectify them and kind of see them as less than human or to be defeated. And so um, the symbols that people use to display their group membership are important to understand, and so you can see some of them here, and some of the kind of artifacts that people have. I'm sure you're familiar with some of these. I had to throw truck nuts in there because it's something that I talk with my students quite a bit about, right? Like what causes somebody to hang genitalia off of their truck, and it's an interesting thing to think about. I want to say a couple of things also, not just about symbols, but about kind of larger structural forces that shape American society. And I'm going to talk about three here that are huge, and really these are topics that could have their own talks. But first of all, it's important to note that like here when I'm at Paul Smith's, this is it's a settler colonial institution that is on Haudenosaunee Mohawk land. Many of you who are across upstate New York are on that land. And settler colonialism, the way it's taught in my children's school is like, the colonists came over and then broke bread with the natives, and it was harmonious, and that elides or kind of leaves aside a very violent genocidal taking of land. And I bring this up because a lot of what I'm going to talk about today, to understand kind of what's happening in the United States, you have to understand the kind of long sweep of settler colonialism, and how it's related to race and violence and the control of resources and property specifically. Um, the other one is something that we talk about in the social sciences called racial capitalism, and that's about how land and markets and capitalism itself is a kind of racialized force or a racist force, and you can see this through the prison industry. We have prisons in this area. We just had a talk from Jeff Hall at Paul Smith's about the role of prisons in shaping culture in the Adirondacks, but also prisons as a space of kind of surplus labor. So some scholars would argue that slavery never really fully ended, or that Jim Crow never really fully ended in the United States. It's just moved into the kind of carceral system. And one of the things I bring this up because this is an area that has an increasing amount of economic inequality, and so one of the things that happens in societies that have profound amounts of economic inequality is that working people are often pitted against one another along cultural or racial lines. And so you can, scholars who study inequality think a lot about how people are divided that way, kind of racially, which is another way of saying that racism is used to divide people. And this book from Jonathan Metzl, I think, is really interesting because he argues, he's a public health researcher, and I taught this book in my sociology class last year at Paul Smith's. But he makes the argument that economic inequality, like people hold on to the privileges that they have, race being one of those privileges, but that it ultimately harms them. So the average life expectancy for whites in the United States has been declining over the last couple of years. And, there's this interesting question of like, why? What's that about? How is it related to kind of systems of oppression and domination? So I wrote a whole editorial on this for the Daily Enterprise last year, mostly to help people think about racism as a structural issue, less as a kind of personal thing, although it certainly is that as well. And so, look that up if you're interested in that. And then there's the final one, which is imperialism, right? Like, so the United States is an empire. We are the kind of current empire, and there's some discussion in history and in sociology and in political science about, is the United States empire kind of coming to an end? Is it not? This is a kind of open debate. Greg Grandin's book on this, which I highly, highly recommend, is about kind of what happens when the frontier project kind of runs out of steam and starts to come home. And we build walls and enclose and kind of fight amongst ourselves. One of the best definitions I've ever heard of fascism is that it's the imperial project brought home. And so here's a couple of books on that. Empire and American Empire impacts our policing as well, which I'll get into. Stuart Schrader's book, Badges Without Borders, about how kind of global counterinsurgency has impacted American policing, is really, really excellent, and just want to highlight that as well. So why this topic? I would rather be working on other things, to be completely honest with you. I first became interested in this maybe 3 or 4 years ago during one of my first classes at Paul Smith's, when I had a student write a paper about how the solution to climate change was kind of violent genocide against non-white people as a form of population control. This was a student who was a kind of proud and out member of one of the neo-fascist groups that was on the ground in Charlottesville, Virginia. There's some pictures of young men there in community with one another. And so I had never encountered that argument before, and I immediately became interested in it. Actually struck up a relationship with this kid and young man, and I'm still in contact with him. And I saw him really, he was really alienated, really struggling to find meaning, and was finding it in kind of digital spaces where there were people who were preying upon him. And as an educator, that gave me some pause, because I could see him going into a dark place, and you could see how it was impacting his mental health and physical health. And I still am in relationship with this kid, and I don't know if I'm doing a good job with it. I have no idea. But so I've been kind of poking around this literature for years, and then January 6th happened, and what you're looking at there is a noose hung in front of the Capitol building on January 6th. If you're familiar at all with right-wing literature, there's something called the Turner Diaries that a lot of white supremacists read and kind of fetishize, and this is in that book. It's called The Day of the Rope. It's this kind of day where there's an execution of legislators and race war. And so when I saw that put up on the grounds of the Capitol building, that gives me pause. I have been referring to January 6th as a race riot, and I'll get into kind of why I think that is the case here. So also, there's been some really good reporting and investigative work done just about the nature and the rise of domestic extremism in America. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this and how it's related specifically to kind of right-wing movements, and like, why focus on right-wing extremism in particular? It is, if you look at an assessment, and people who are way higher than me in this, the FBI looks at this, Department of Homeland Security looks at this, the predominant form of kind of violent extremism in the United States right now is right-wing extremism. There is far-left extremism. There's still religious extremism that happens for interesting reasons, but far and away, right-wing extremism is the kind of dominant form. And so I think it's really important to focus in on that. It's also important to note that our intelligence agencies have been following this for a while. The report that you're seeing here on the left is a threat assessment from the Department of Homeland Security from, I think, 2009. And they made the argument in that, and this report got buried, but they make the argument here that the election of a Black president was going to fuel a kind of resurgence of right-wing populist extremism. And that was such a politically controversial statement at the time that Department of Homeland Security, I believe under Janet Napolitano, kind of buried this. Also, the thing that you're looking at on the right is a unclassified FBI counterterrorism document about how white supremacists have been kind of infiltrating law enforcement. And there's a lot of overlap actually between law enforcement and the white power movement. And so you should just, all of this to say that like, this is an active area of law enforcement, and there are certainly people who can speak more to that than I can. There are people, intelligence analysts, who specialize in this specific stuff, probably increasingly so given recent events in this country. So some tentative definitions. I should say right off the bat that like, the terms fascism and authoritarianism are slippery terms that are debated, and there's a really intense debate going on in academia right now about like, were the last 4 years a kind of neo-fascism or authoritarian movement? And I don't want to come down on any particular side of that debate, but I just want to point out that like, what we're going to be talking about here are when I say authoritarianism, I'm talking about the kind of maintenance of hierarchy and the maintenance of social hierarchy by limiting others' political freedom. These are anti-democratic movements, right? They restrict people's ability to participate fully in the franchise of democracy. Fascism is the kind of that, but made into kind of official state policy and practices. It's different in different countries. So like, neo-fascism or authoritarianism looks different in Brazil than it looks in Japan, than it looks in India. India is having quite the kind of fascist moment right now, if you know anything about Modi's kind of what's called neoliberal fascism. And so in the United States, the social hierarchy and the right to rule over others is directly related to what I was talking about earlier: settler colonialism and chattel slavery, treating people as objects to be controlled. And that's a racist process. It's a classist process. It's in many ways a gendered process. I'm not going to talk a ton about gender today, but I will get into it a little bit. It's different in different countries, and so the context really matters there. South Africa, when I was in South Africa, apartheid was a kind of a tyrannical system. And you know, I was barely alive for some of that, but you can see how that still shapes South African society. Totally different racial categories in South Africa, race as a social construct. So just want to, the best person I know to read on this is Hannah Arendt, one of my favorite scholars, one of my favorite philosophers, just giant fan of her work. So if you're interested in that. To bring this into kind of anthropology and political science, Mary Douglas and her co-authors in writing in Purity and Danger and a bunch of other places, looks at kind of the structuring worldviews that people have that shape their kind of ideal society, or how they think the world should be ordered. So you could all, like, I could give you a series of tests, and I've done this kind of research where you ask people their conceptions of gun control and government and abortion and things like this, and you can more or less plot kind of where people are at in terms of their worldview at any time. And worldviews change over time. People change their beliefs, and they're not kind of static, fixed things. But Corey Robin, the political theorist, talks a lot in his study of conservatism as a kind of reactionary force, that a lot of what we're going to talk about, again, is the kind of the maintenance of social hierarchy. And that occurs along race lines, class lines, gender lines. That's primarily what we're talking about here. These are anti-egalitarian movements. One thing to say from sociology is that it's often thought that like people develop their beliefs and then go seek out the groups that espouse those beliefs. And there's a small raft of literature in sociology that shows that actually it's the other way around, that people tend to be in relationship with each other, and then the beliefs kind of follow from that. So there's a really great book on this called The Making of Pro-Life Activists, which is basically shows that like human beings are social creatures. We want to be around people that accept us. And so if you can be in community with people, you're likely to kind of take on the beliefs of those community. It gives people a sense of shared purpose and commonality and community. And those are deeply powerful things to understand. The young man that I talked about, my student from a couple of years ago, very much was seeking community. He was a kind of atomized young man who was finding community online with people who were preying on him. And so that's just important to think about as well. There's a really great book on the kind of tenets of fascism, and I'm not going to read all of these, but Jason Stanley, who's a philosopher who works on these things, he talks about some of the things that make kind of fascist movements and formations that bind them together kind of across their differences. So this sense of a mythic past, kind of that you need to go back to kind of make it great again. Fact, kind of often a attack on a fact-based reality. You can see that with the rise of conspiracy movements in the United States. Hierarchy, which we've talked about, law and order, and a specific kind of law and order where the society is organized in particular ways. This is an interesting week to be talking about this because America is very much grappling with the role of police in the maintenance of social order. This sense of sexual anxiety is really interesting, and we've seen some violence around that. I'm thinking of the shooter in Georgia, who was this kind of deeply sexually anxious person. So this book is way more into it, but I just want to point some of these out because you'll see how they shape kind of where we're going to go. So let's get into some of these, right? So this, I'm going to start with symbols that are kind of more general and groups that are more general, and then I'm going to get more specific. This is by no means a kind of conclusive study. This is me as an anthropologist trying to pay attention to the descriptive environment around me. And this one is one of the more common kind of symbols. This is not actually the flag of the Confederacy, it's the battle flag of Tennessee. And we should remember that the Civil War was about some states committing treason in defense of slavery, in defense of an economic system that objectified people. This gentleman is carrying the Confederate flag through the halls of Congress, I think the first time in I don't know if it had actually ever happened. Some historian can correct me on this one, but the thing that I find most interesting about this is that in my area, I'm starting to see the Confederate flag kind of increasingly blended with the United States flag, which, if you just think about that for a minute, historically doesn't make sense, right? Because it literally was a rejection of the United States. Like, we fought a civil war over a group of states that wanted to kind of reject the very notion of the United States. It's succession, right? And so then what's that about, right? What's that a statement about? To me, this guy with the shirt on the bottom right here, I saw that shirt at a man wearing this shirt at the A&W in Wilmington when I was drinking a root beer, and I had to just stop and look at it for a while, right? That's a Confederate flag laid over the states in the North, and so that is a man expressing his affinity for a particular kind of racial order and social order, even though he's physically in the states that were on the kind of Union side of the war. So this is one that we have grappled with on our campus. I will say that many of my students, when you actually engage them in conversation about the Confederate flag, many of them have not actually thought about what it actually represents or what it stands for. They're like, well, I watched Dukes of Hazzard and I've never really thought about it, right? And so it's really interesting to me as an educator to kind of engage in conversation over what these things mean. This one is complicated and one that I'm going to spend a decent amount of time on right now, but you all have probably seen this. The Punisher logo and the Blue Lives Matter flag. And one thing I want to say about the Blue Lives Matter flag is that it emerges only after and as a reaction to the Black Lives Matter movement. So the Blue Lives Matter movement is considered in sociology a kind of counter movement. It's a movement in reaction to another movement. And it's fundamentally about the reassertion of the role of police in the hierarchical ordering of society, or as some scholars call it, and I'll show you some scholarship on this in the next slide, a kind of police nationalism. And so you can see there the thin blue line iconography predates this. The thin blue line is, if you know anything about police culture, it's this kind of line that is used to talk about the fraternity and brotherhood of police, as the kind of the only thing standing between kind of order and chaos. And so thin blue line is used, like when an officer dies, they'll put the blue line over their badges. It predates Black Lives Matter. What I'm interested in, though, is the flag, and notice the kind of black and white flag. This erosion of nuance, the abuse actually of U.S. flag code here to make it a kind of black and white thing. This gentleman on the right in the U.S. Senate on January 6th, you can see on his chest, on his kind of flak jacket there, the Punisher logo, and the blue line over the state of Tennessee. That's actually how he was identified, and ultimately arrested. He's carrying flex cuff zip ties in his hand to do what? Who knows? But the Punisher logo, if you know anything about the Punisher comic, it's actually a deeply ironic logo to use, because the Punisher was actually quite kind of anti-police, and the creator of the Punisher is very kind of pro Black Lives Matter, and has written about how basically these people need to stop using the logo. But it emerges, it was used by the sniper Chris Kyle as a kind of symbol, and there's this sense of kind of Punisher as like enforcer of the law, or kind of outside the law, or something like that. So you'll see this around, often on, whenever I see like a big dark black truck, I immediately look for Punisher logos on the back of them, and you'll be surprised how many you'll see. It's important to know here that if you know anything about the history of policing in the United States, the very first police agencies arise as groups, fugitive slave patrols. Policing has always been wrapped up with race, and going all the way back. And when I teach policing to my students, I always say, like, all societies police. It's a question of who is getting policed, what are they policing, what's the role of police in the ordering of society, and those are the questions that we're very much talking about this week specifically. I should say that Blue Lives Matter is a really complex movement. I just want to read this excerpt. There's a bunch of really interesting sociology coming out on this movement of people who are studying it, but it's complicated. If you slap a Blue Lives Matter flag on your vehicle, or you wear a Blue Lives Matter mask, does that make you an ethno-nationalist? Maybe. The people who have studied this say actually that it's really complicated, and some people do it because they just have an affinity for police, and they haven't really thought through like the racial implications of that. It kind of remains to be seen where this movement goes, whether it's even a coherent movement. It doesn't really have a kind of central organization like other social movements, and so I think that this is one of the ones that's interesting to think about, and we will see, I think, how this plays out, especially as this country continues to grapple with issues of policing and race. But one thing I want to come back to is this kind of rigidity of thought, and the idea that nuance itself is a kind of form of weakness. And in sociology, we talk about the kind of the post-Fordist, or the economic crisis of masculinity that's going on, and men specifically are kind of trying to figure out their place in society. And so you see this kind of rigid display of masculinity above some men, where like any sort of nuance is kind of seen as weak, as less than. And you can think about the kind of black and white, the black and whiteness of ideas and of symbols that is kind of playing out. I'll show you some more examples of this, but if you want to read a really excellent piece, Nate Powell, who's an artist, has this really good anthropological piece on like death and clothing and military and American flag and policing, and it's super interesting and probably worthy of its own kind of presentation by itself. But let's just get into kind of some more examples of this. So this is the Gadsden Flag, very old historic flag in American history. You started to see this a lot around the around 2008, 2009, 2010, associated with the Tea Party movement, which interestingly reemerges during or emerges during the Obama administration as a kind of reaction to the first Black president. Scholars who study the Tea Party look at the kind of racial implications of the Tea Party movement, and there's a bunch of scholarship on that. But it's about the reason it's used by a lot of Second Amendment people is that the Second Amendment, and Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz's book is really excellent on this, and Patrick Blanchfield as well, who we've had at Paul Smith's to speak. The Second Amendment emerges during a time of kind of intense settler colonialism and control of land. And so it's fundamentally about guns as a technology of power and control, and the way in which freedom is kind of wrapped up in that. Interestingly, after the latest election, I started seeing these kind of black and white "Don't Tread on Me" flags pop up around, and so no longer, like, notice the color is going away, and now you have this kind of liberty or death, right? See the kind of the lack of nuance there. It's this very very kind of binary choice around this stuff. So I first found this really interesting when I started thinking about, like, how is it that you get a Gadsden flag sticker on a car right next to a police sticker on a car, and that is actually not inconsistent if your ideology is about kind of controlling some people and other people having freedom. It is not an inconsistent ideology to have those things next to each other. These are very specific groups, and these are groups, members of these groups have been charged with conspiracy in the January 6th riot. Oath Keepers and Three Percenters. I have had students who have been members of these groups and have seen this iconography on our campus. These are kind of quote unquote anti-government militia movements. And I use that word anti-government loosely. They themselves will define themselves as anti-government. But really, when you dig into it, it's kind of anti-government of a particular kind, right? It's this notion that, like, some people, that the Constitution is kind of affords rights to some people and not others. And so Oath Keepers, Three Percenters, this flag here is a Three Percenter flag that I see. I've seen it flying here in the Adirondacks. And it's about this kind of, like, armed fetishization of the Constitution. The black, you may see this kind of black Molon Labe statement sometimes. This comes out, that means come and take them. It's a kind of Spartan motto, but also used on the flag of Texas. You've probably seen a cannon flag in Texas. That was used in Texas during a period of settler colonialism. And so these are groups that recruit from active duty police and military units. And there was an overrepresentation of veterans and military personnel at the January 6th riot as well, which is something to think about. What is that about as well? So NCPR a couple of months ago, or a month ago, has reported on this, that there are kind of far-right militia members in St. Lawrence County. Overall, the larger pattern here is the kind of the militarization of American culture. And it's important to note here that, like, America is a war-making culture. For many of my students, we have been at war for their entire lives. And that makes its way back into the culture. So Kathleen Ballou's book on this, on the white power movement and how it's related to especially Vietnam, and Radley Balco, who's a libertarian and writes about the way in which kind of the militarization of America's police forces. I'm fascinated with Black Rifle Coffee Company, which is, just go to their website and look at their products and ponder the militarization of coffee. But this is basically the Empire Project, Imperial Project coming home. And again, like I said, veterans and law enforcement officers are preyed upon, disproportionately represented. These kind of black and white shirts are worn. I see a lot of these on our campus, and with the American flag, the kind of battle flag, right, facing into battle. And I always ask my students, I'm like, who are you fighting? Like, what are you going into battle against? And, you know, they don't they don't really think about it that way, but it's just this way in which it kind of informs the broader culture. Notice this gentleman here with the just the tip shirt with a bullet on it, right? The kind of like the gendered connotations there, right? Like you're about to get penetrated by a bullet is interesting to think through. Um, this is a very specific couple of very specific groups that you might want to kind of know about. I have seen Boogaloo Boy iconography on my own campus. Not so much of the Proud Boys. You've probably heard of some of these. These are complex organizations, but again, related to the maintenance of social hierarchy. Proud Boys have been responsible for a lot of violence in America recently, and the Boogaloo Boys. These are kind of too complex to go into, but just the Hawaiian shirt kind of like trolling is really interesting to think about, right? Like for many of them, the culture is a way of having fun, right? Like you wear your Hawaiian shirt, you go out and you kind of delight in the hierarchy, is a jouissance, if you want to use that term. It's kind of delighting in the domination or the suffering of others. This one is very specific to this area. And I don't know much about it other than I've had some people report to me that they've seen some iconography around this. This is Frat Rock on the right there outside of Potsdam, which some of you may know. And you can see on the kind of bottom right of that a kind of Patriot Front. And these are some stickers, kind of America First Patriot Front stickers. And I love the not stolen, conquered, right? Like again, settler colonialism, but you can see the kind of red, white, and blue symbols there. The fascistes, the kind of bundle of sticks with the blade, which is a traditional fascist logo. This group, in my read of it, is structured around kind of preserving white identity, and this conflation of whiteness with American, and that's a move that a lot of these groups make. There's this assumption that whiteness and American are the kind of normal or natural or preferred state. Very obsessed with white birth rates and white reproduction, and I'll say more about that in a minute. Huge slide here, and I'm not going to go too far into this, but when you actually dig into some of the ideology, there's this notion that like they'll make the assertion that like Western or kind of European culture is ideal. But that's a very broad term. Whenever I would talk to students, I'd be like, "What are you talking about? Like which European cultures?" Like it's so nebulously used, and it is a kind of global movement. And there's this thought that that there's a conspiracy. It's a conspiracy theory called replacement theory, that like there is a broader conspiracy to basically like out reproduce whites from the society or from societies. So how this plays out, you're looking at the top here, the 1488, 14 words is a kind of thing that is in white power movements. 88 is the letter H. So in 88 is a way of saying Heil Hitler in a very coded language. And the 14 words, you can Google them and look them up, but that's something that is kind of stated as well around this kind of white genocide is often what it's called. But the toward a new society thing that you're looking at here, this is an image from the Shooters Manifesto in El Paso. And there's this belief that kind of like ethnic replacement is happening, and that people need to kind of act out violently to keep this from happening. I put a picture of Tucker Carlson there because Tucker Carlson the other day on his show was very clearly flirting with this kind of conspiracy theory. And so the way he was talking about kind of demographic replacement in the United States was extremely similar to this kind of replacement theory. These are the kind of broader structuring worldviews that are at play here, and it's about kind of race and power. This is the thing that I'm particularly interested in and what I'm working with. I'm working with a couple of Paul Smith students on a manuscript about how environmental education contributes to this. But we're seeing a rise of kind of ecofascism. And ecofascism is essentially white supremacy mixed with environmentalism. And if you know anything about the history of environmentalism, it has a really long and troubled history. You're looking at pictures there of Garrett Hardin and John Muir, and the obsession within environmental movements, which is a broad term, but with eugenics, with purity logics, with land, with quote invasives and population control. And that's something that I'm working on specifically. This is my own kind of direct interest in this right now. Um, there's this assumption sometimes that, like, especially in my area of climate change, that like we'll just teach people about climate change and then they'll act in ways that are kind of pro-social and pro-environmental. And the thing is, like, eco-fascists and the El Paso shooter and the Christchurch shooter, they take climate change very seriously. They think that action is of a particular kind, right? A kind of a violent kind, and so that's something for us to think about as well. The gentleman on the right here is the Q shaman. You've probably seen him, pictures of him. When he was in prison, I saw a lot of people making fun of him because he requested organic food, and they were like, "Oh, look at this guy with his organic food." And if you know anything about ecofascism, that's not actually surprising at all, because it's about purity. It's about this notion of bodily purification and whiteness as a sense of purity, which was an animating force in Nazi Germany. So I teach a class at Paul Smith's called Comparative Policy Analysis, and now I just want to like zoom way out. When you look at the political parties around the world, and this is a social science project called the Manifesto Project, where they look at political parties around the world based on really two indicators: orientation towards capitalism and markets, and orientation towards kind of racial ideology, the kind of racial capitalism that I was talking about earlier. The US Republican Party, which is complicated and there are differences within the party, is considered one of the most right-wing political parties in the world, and more to the right than the Conservative Party of Canada or the Austrian Freedom Party, or certainly the Tories in England. The Democratic Party, up until recently, was also a right-wing party. It's only towards the end of the Obama administration, when they start to make moves around kind of racial justice and regulating capitalism, that they start to move left of center. So that's always an interesting thing to think about. But we had two right-wing parties in the United States only up until recently, and that's just interesting to consider relative to this. We are seeing the rise of kind of neo-fascist movements around the world, and so they are arising again in Germany, in a bunch of other countries as well, Greece. So I study education, and I just want to point out a couple of books here that are useful. Cynthia Miller Idris is a sociologist of education who talks about how kind of people learn these things. You're not born racist. You're not born with this kind of stuff. It's learned, and it's learned often in digital online spaces. So Talia Levine's book, which kind of goes into the digital spaces, is a really interesting book too. And Scott Atran, I throw this book in because Scott Atran is an anthropologist who studies young male violence, and mostly actually with Islamic forms of violence. And one of the points he makes in some of his work on white nationalist violence is that they're related, because it's about dislocated, mostly young men who are, but not entirely, who are kind of trying to find meaning in a world that is isolating and uncertain to them, right? And so there are going to be people who kind of prey upon them and give them a sense of purpose and meaning. And so education becomes really interesting here. I won't get too far into this, but those of us who study this study what's called the communities of practice, which basically is like, how is it that people enter into a community? How do they engage in what's called legitimate peripheral participation? How does then their entrance into a community become central to their sense of identity? And so Levin Wenger's work on this is really, really good, on the notion of a community of practice. And so I'm really interested in this, like, how do people become certain kinds of people? And that's related to kind of cultural theories of learning. I say all of this because I think our educational systems are grappling with this. I'm a school board member in Saranac Lake, And this is a recent draft of a document that we just got the other day from the Board of Regents, and this is a quote from it. Right, the Board of Regents asserts its expectation that all school districts will develop policies that advance diversity, equity, and inclusion, and that they will implement such policies with fidelity and urgency. There are really interesting First Amendment issues, and if you know anything about your education law, Tinker versus Des Moines is a classic Supreme Court case, which looks at the right to free speech and free expression in educational institutions. And the right to free speech is not an absolute right, just like the Second Amendment is not an absolute right. And there are kind of implications and responsibilities that go along with this. So courts, and I'm by no means an expert on this, but courts will do something called, it's still called to this day, the Tinker test, which is basically like, does a certain kind of speech merit or warrant, is it a kind of substantial disruption, right? So at what point does it become, is it no longer speech and becomes a kind of threat of violence? And that's really where I think police agencies have to kind of think about it, and attorneys and law enforcement have to think about that as well. So I always go to others on this topic because it's not my area of specialization. I'm no means a legal expert, but I think we're going to have to really grapple about this in terms of educational institutions. And so the last thing that I'll leave you with, January 6th was interesting in a couple of ways, because if you remember that day, the morning that you had a Jewish man and an African American man who were elected senators from the state of Georgia. And then later that day, you had this kind of race riot and insurrection by people who were upset about the legitimacy and didn't believe in the legitimacy of an election. And one of the things that I wonder a lot about, and I love to think with Carol Anderson and Keonga Taylor on these, is, maybe perhaps we are finally becoming a pluralistic, multiracial, and therefore truly representative democracy. And maybe it's that some people want to resist that. And maybe that's the thing that we should talk about over this kind of very young democracy that we have here in the United States. So I will stop there, and I'm happy to answer any questions in the next 10 minutes or so. So I'll stop sharing. Mm-hmm. So yeah, so Gwen asks, I've seen quite a few born and raised and protected by God's guns, guts, and glory flags in the area. Are these connected with any particular group or just Second Amendment in general? Gwen, I don't know if those are, it sounds to me, having spent a good amount of time around gun culture, I should turn my camera on here for a minute, that sounds like kind of just general gun culture stuff. But again, even in that, you see the kind of like God, guns, glory. It's this perception of the nation, born and raised, right? There's this natality to it, right? That like the nation is for kind of particular kind of people. I mean, you see this even in like the way we talk about gun regulations as like un-American, right? Like don't infringe upon my American rights, right? When you actually read DC versus Heller, for example, Antonin Scalia, who is a conservative, like really teases out how like freedoms are American and also responsibilities are also American. So it's an interesting thing too. I would say it's probably general Second Amendment, but that's a good question. One thing I would say, Gwen, is there's the Anti-Defamation League has a really good dictionary and database of hate symbols, and you might want to just poke around on that a little bit. Jennifer asked the notion like, what's the relationship between neoliberalism and the rise of kind of white supremacy and anti-government groups? So this is a complicated one, but briefly, if you're not familiar with neoliberalism, it's the ordering of the state around markets. So marketization of social life. So individualized student debt compared to like free college, or individualized healthcare compared to like a universal healthcare system. So neoliberalism kind of starts really in the 30s as a response to that, but really ramps up in the 80s under Reagan and Thatcher and actually Carter. It's a kind of bipartisan project. But there's this, Jennifer, to be very brief on this one, basically the rollback of government services coincides with the rise of a kind of multicultural democracy. So it's right when minorities start to get more power in social life that those public institutions start to get kind of wound down. And so people who look at the kind of higher education area will talk about this, about that's when we start to defund our public services, when they become available to everybody, right? So that's a much longer answer to that. Yeah, so Sierra, this is really interesting. The notion of cottagecore, the aesthetic of colonial farming, land ownership, homesteading, right, is in this as well. Um, I think you're right that the kind of back to the land movement, like, it has always been wrapped up and close to some of this. When you think about the fascists that were marching through Charlottesville, they were chanting "blood and soil," right? That this notion of the kind of the homeland, or the motherland, right? The which was very powerful in Nazi iconography and Nazi belief as well. So I think, I don't know that, I mean, maybe liberals think about this, but I mentioned an article called what was it called? I think it's in the Daily Beast. It's called like Fascists at the Farmers Market. You should read that one. It's really, really interesting. Ryan asked a question about the Confederate flags, and I think the Confederate flag is a hard one, right? Because I think there are some people who fly it knowing exactly what it means, and then I think there are other people who fly it in a more kind of innocuous way. And just speaking as somebody who works with students, many of my, it's just kind of in the culture. And I think in a broad sense, not in a very specific sense, like I talked about some of those other groups. So I don't know. I think there's work to be done about, as with any of these symbols, how are people using them? Are they kind of real true believers? Like I said, with the Blue Lives Matter flag, that's a complicated movement, and people probably fly it for all kinds of reasons. And that's something that, like, as social scientists, we need to really get our heads around. So somebody asked, can I recommend any books on ecofascism? There aren't many, and I think one of the things that I'm doing is trying to do some of that research myself. Here is one that I just picked up, called "The American West and the Nazi East," and it's on the relationship between kind of westward expansion. Some people may not know this, but the Nazis borrowed a lot of tactics from the United States, specifically around Jim Crow laws and the racial segregation in the United States. And so that's interesting too. There's a scholar, Julia Ostertag, who's a friend of mine, who has some work in her dissertation about, like, gardening and the kind of purity of nature around garden culture, which is really interesting to think about. So that's something to think about too. Yeah, I mean, a lot of the questions that are coming in, which are really, really excellent questions, and I hope that one of the things that this like provokes you all to do is to think about, like, what's the response. I noticed that nowhere in my presentation did I really have a, like, what do we do about this? I think we're still thinking about that. I mean, I think some of it has to do with I mean, law enforcement certainly has to get involved if there are kind of violent elements at work there. That's a huge issue. There are broader cultural issues around the North Country as a very white space. I've raised this point to my colleagues and students, even at Paul Smith's, right? Like, we're a predominantly white institution, and in a country that is changing demographically. And so, will we continue to be viable as an institution if we don't get our heads around some of these issues around inclusion and diversity? And I think you see that conversation going on at the level of towns and municipalities. And so I think that's something that we all have to get our heads around. I'm sorry I can't respond to all the questions. They're very, very good questions, but it would be really great if we could think about some sort of regional network to tackle this, maybe among educators. So thank you all for being here. I know it's noon, and so I want to be careful with everybody's time. And so it's Friday. Enjoy the nicer weather, everybody. Thank you to everybody out there doing good work. Onward.